This is the inaugural meeting of our Leadership Council, and it's a diverse, exciting range of individuals who share a belief in the critical importance of high-performing pre-K through 12 schools and equally high-performing colleges and universities for the benefit of the Commonwealth and the country. And I'm very grateful to each one of you for accepting our invitation and joining us today. I am also very grateful to our two co-chairs of the Leadership Council for their support of Lesley and their track record in commitment to quality education for everyone in our diverse communities. I'm very honored to introduce our co-chairs who will also welcome you to today's discussion, Lesley alum Kitty Dukakis and Governor Mike Dukakis.
Wow. We were on this campus and were delighted when we received the honorary degrees. Nobody's been able to tell me exactly how long ago that was, but my memory at my age is not 100% all the time, and Michael might remember, but I'm not even going to ask him. And our oldest grandchild, who is 22, is graduating in 2 weeks from Bates College, where her great-grandmother went to school. And that has been a joy for her. Coming from Los Angeles, this child, I was sure, was going to not make it in Lewiston, Maine. She has never complained about the weather. And that says something about her. She's a terrific kid. Of course, I would say this is my grandchild and the first one, and very close to Michael and myself. But she's going to have 17 relatives going up to Bates for her graduation, and we're very pleased about that. But we've had a very special 55 years, Michael and I'm sorry, 48 years. We've got 2 more years to our 50th. And we have decided that we're going to be taking our children and their spouses and their children, our grandchildren, we have 8, to the island where Michael's father came to the United States. And trying to organize the kids' school programs has probably been one of the more difficult things I've ever had to do. But we are determined that all of them will be able to go with us and spend 2 weeks with us on the island of Lesbos on Mytilene. And yesterday, I just want to mention, I was in Washington, D.C. I had served for 22 years on the Holocaust Board, on the original board that built the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I was taken off by President Bush, and I was put back on just 4 months ago by President Barack Obama. And I was delighted to be there, very sad that many of the survivors who were members of that original group are no longer with us. But we had some pretty emotional experiences, and I think some of you remember my dad. The Marine Band played at the Rotunda for the lighting of the 6 candles representing the 6 million who were killed during the Holocaust. And all of a sudden I noticed a very attractive Asian woman with a violin under her arm. And I steeled myself because it is so difficult for me to hear that instrument and not begin to fall apart because of the closeness of my dad and the many years that he played that instrument. And this young woman got up and played Kol Nidra without any music in front of her. And it was one of the most beautiful playings I have ever heard. And so I talked to the conductor. I told him about my background, and he asked me if I would go and talk to her. And I met today with some people in education and talked about bringing this woman to the Pops and possibly having her perform with them. But just quickly, one of the wonderful experiences that I had when I was in Washington was sitting at a brunch in the Congress with all of my fellow members of the board. And I sat next to a woman I had served with for a while and began to hear her talk to the man across from us who was a liberator. Her father had been a survivor. He passed away visiting the camps the year before. But within minutes, we all determined that this man was one of her father's liberators. And it was an extraordinary experience to hear him talk about what it was like, and for this daughter of somebody who had been in the camps for 4 or 5 years. Anyhow, life has been full and wonderful, and I'm delighted that we've taken on another challenge, and especially at the school where I ended up graduating from soon before Michael and I were married. So thank you.
It's good to be here. I want you all to know that we're passing up the President of the United States for Lesley University, and that's the truth. You know, Kitty was not only a student here, she taught modern dance for many years while I was governor. So on Tuesday and Thursday nights, I was home with the kids, and she was over here teaching, which was fine. But I just want to say to all of you that we're pleased and honored to be part of this. This was a very important part of our lives because, as some of you know, Kitty left Penn State to marry a classmate of hers. Fortunately for me, it wasn't a very happy marriage. And so she came back to Boston with this little 3-year-old to resume her studies at Lesley. And interestingly enough, it was Sandy Bacalar, now my high school girlfriend, who said to me, you know, Kitty Dixon's coming back to town. Now, I didn't know Kitty. She says she handed me a cup of water on Beacon Street when I ran the marathon in 1951 as a high school senior, but I don't remember that. And of course, I was a senior and she was a freshman at Brookline High School, and I was not interested in freshman women, although the freshman boys kept talking about this Kitty Dixon person. But it all began here. And Lesley was very much a part of that, and very much a part of our lives through Kitty when she taught here. So we feel very close to this place. And I just want to say quickly, and then we're going to wrap it up because we've got a very special guest, 2 special guests, that I'm very proud of what this state of ours has done in public education. And I don't think we celebrate it enough, folks, because this state for the past 3 or 4 years has ranked consistently #1 in the United States of America in K through 12. And if I had my druthers, we'd be putting up we're #1 flag in front of every public school in America, in every public school in the Commonwealth, and I mean that. And while we've had our contentious moments, and nobody knows that better than the Secretary of Education, and I'm a great admirer of Paul's, to a very great extent, it's been with a high degree of collaboration. The idea that we can strengthen and improve our public education system without involving the folks that teach our kids actively in that reform process is absolute nonsense. And I don't know this guy. I don't know this guy in New Jersey. I've never met him. But if he thinks he's going to improve public education in the state of New Jersey with the kind of approach that he's taking, he's crazy. You don't get things done in the public sector, folks, with that kind of stuff. You get it done, get those things, good things done by bringing people together and involving them actively in what you're trying to do. And obviously that must include the folks that are, after all, at the center of our education system, and those are the folks who teach our kids. And as our guest will tell us, I assume, it's good teaching and, I might add, good parenting that makes the difference. And I'm just very proud of what we've done. Proud of our Secretary of Education, the governor that appointed him and has led this effort. And Diane, it's just great to have you here because you're one of the few people these days that seems to me to be making any sense of all of this as we kind of swing back and forth from one extreme to the other. In any event, enough speech making from us. It's great to be here. We look forward to spending some time with you. We've got to leave you a little early, not before we have an opportunity to spend time with our guests, because for some reason the Massachusetts College of Art is honoring Kitty and me. And, you know, when they start honoring you, you know you're on your way out, folks. So, but we had a lot to do with saving that place and turning it around. So we're looking forward to that. But in any event, it's great to be here, great to be part of this council. And Joe, thank you so much for asking us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you both. So our group includes Lesley alums, members of our board, faculty, staff, administrators, parents, and grandparents of Lesley students and alums, friends, colleagues from some other higher ed institutions, some foundations from state government. Each of you should be introduced. You're not going to be. Sorry. But I do want to acknowledge a few people who you should know are here. Really grateful to have Paul Revel, our Secretary of Education, here, and the parent of a Lesley alum. Our colleague here, Cambridge Schools Superintendent Jeff Young, Rebecca Upham, a partner and head of school at Buckingham, Brown, and Nichols. I don't know if Jim Brett's here or not. I don't know if Jim made it, but Jim's planned on joining us. Jim's the CEO of the New England Council and was just named last week to chair the President's Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities. The chair of the Mass Board of Higher Education, Dr. Charles Desmond, is here, and Joe Spalding, President and CEO of the City Performing Arts Center. I'm pleased to be involved with that group. Good friend Kevin Phelan, co-chairman of Colliers International Boston. George Matthews, who many of you know, the board chair emeritus at Northeastern and the co-founder of Collegiate Enterprise Solutions. And the grandparents of an AIB Lesley alum and good friends of Lesley, Kate and Al Merck. It's great to have you here. And finally, my boss, the chair of the Lesley Board of Trustees, Debbie Schwartz-Raises. So it's great to have you all here. We're interested in having a dialogue that follows a conversation with a speaker, and we'd like to do this a couple times a year. Next fall, we're already set, October 27th, it's in the program. We've got Bob Zemsky coming. Bob is probably one of the top higher ed analysts and writers in the country out of the University of Pennsylvania, worked for Pew for many years. His new book, Making Reform Work, The Case for Transforming American Higher Ed, was a book he wrote at the end of his service on the ill-fated Spellings Commission, which was supposed to reform higher ed. So that should be quite interesting. We celebrated Lesley's centennial last year, and we actually aspire to have an even greater impact in our second 100 years. But for us to do that, we've got to escape the narrow and occasionally traditional perspectives that come with the daily administration of a complex, comprehensive university. And so while we develop new programs, invest in employees, expand our technological and core resources, design new partnerships, support lifelong learning, we've got to put ourselves in situations such as this today where we're free to engage with other people in questions of policy that affect the communities that we're supposed to serve. To help you understand why we care about issues such as school choice, funding, testing, teachers' unions, curriculum, technology, quick background about Lesley. We enroll about 9,000 students a year through 4 schools, 2 undergraduate schools, the Art Institute of Boston and Lesley College, and 2 graduate schools, the Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences and the Graduate School of Education, which is the largest by far of the 4 schools. We've got 3 campuses here in Cambridge, this one at Porter Square, and one over Brattle. The other 2 are 10-minute walks from here. We see the spine of Mass Ave as our student center, and we work and we walk and we operate in these communities, the residential communities that are east and west of Mass Ave. Lesley's been training teachers now for 101 years and serving teachers across the country for more than 30 years, substantial numbers of teachers. As much as any higher ed institution in the country, Lesley works directly with hundreds of school districts in almost half the 50 states. So we think we have a sense of what's going on out there, of the pressures that are taking place, what's working, what's not. But that world is changing rapidly. Funding for teacher professional development and continuing education is more constrained than ever. School budgets are under severe pressures. The connection, especially in the urban settings between a community and its schools, is being replaced by fragmented educational choices, most with unsustainable financial plans. And the state and federal regulatory environments, all except Massachusetts, are increasingly irrational. At a time when digital technology has made geographic borders between states or among countries virtually irrelevant, federal and most state governments continue to adopt pre-digital geographic-based regulations. The combination of 51 regulatory climates and the absence of a national curriculum restricts us from effectively and efficiently serving practicing teachers and training new teachers on a national scale. And finally, the old distinction in higher ed between public and private, not-for-profit higher ed institutions, those distinctions are fading and less relevant when compared to the more critical and relevant distinction between not-for-profit institutions, both public and private, and the for-profit higher ed sector. So it's in this context that we engage in today's discussion as we consider Lesley's mission and our strategic plans, our values, and how we implement them. And that brings me to the topics that our guest might address with us today. Few higher ed institutions have as much history or as much at stake as Lesley in these topics that influence pre-K through 12 schooling. The issues of school choice, testing, school funding, teacher training and curriculum, and educational standards affect exactly what we do here, what we teach, how we teach, who we recruit, where we develop our partnerships. So what happens, quote unquote, out there influences what we do in here, and a few of us are thinking that maybe what we do in here will influence what goes on out there. And there are very few people who are more knowledgeable, engaged, or articulate about these issues than Professor Diane Ravitch. Currently research professor of education at NYU, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author, co-author, editor, co-editor of over 20 books, countless articles, recognized as one of the country's most highly respected educational historians. The bonus is that she knows the political environment as well as anyone, through her scholarship, but also as a participant in the public policy debates, through her service on national and state commissions and committees as Assistant Secretary of Education in the administration of the first President Bush, and by her appointment by President Clinton to the National Assessment Governing Board that oversees federal testing. Her most recent book, which we've shared, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education, is a very important book that incorporates what she does so well, describing the current situation with a range of details that reveal and connect, placing the moment in a historical context, blending personal anecdote with telling interviews and data, and mixing in a huge measure of common sense. Dr. Ravitch has kindly agreed to engage in a Q&A with me for about 30 minutes, and then we hope that will set the stage for a Q&A with you. So would you please join me in welcoming Professor Diane Ravitch. Let's see if these mics are working. Can you hear me all right? Great.
Well, first let me say thank you, because as I was looking at the Lesley banner, I realized I went to college just a few miles from here to a college that just had 3 more letters on it.
At the beginning.
Wellesley.
That's right. We still get their mail. And the ones with the checks we keep. So, I want to start with the title of your book. It's a very conscious connection by you to the Jane Jacobs 1961 classic, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And in the intro, she wrote, quote, "This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. It is an attack on the principles and aims that have shaped modern orthodox city planning and rebuilding. I shall be writing about how cities work in real life, because this is the only way to learn what principles of planning and what practices in rebuilding can promote social and economic vitality in cities." So beyond the title, would you talk about this connection to the Jane Jacobs book?
Sure. Well, it was a conscious connection because one of the themes of my book, well, two actually. One of the themes of my book is the disconnect between those people who see like a state, and I write about this, those policymakers who are in Washington, sometimes in state capitals, sometimes in think tanks, and they know how to do everything, but they don't talk to teachers. And so those who see like a state, and Jane Jacobs wrote about them, they were the urban planners who knew how to fix cities by creating massive housing projects that people couldn't live in comfortably. And she understood that what makes for a good life is having a community. And that's the second theme, is community. And it was one of her themes. She talked about having eyes on the street. And I became very conscious of the importance of eyes on the street because for the past 25 years or so, I've lived in Brooklyn Heights in a neighborhood where there are eyes on the street and where neighbors look out for one another. Most kids in the neighborhood go to the neighborhood school. And people have said to me, oh, that's so nostalgic. That's not the way we are anymore. And yet I think that it scares me to think that we might be moving into a world of alienation and of individualism in which people are not connected to one another. And I see this happening in New York City as a whole, where I live, and in many other cities where there might be a dozen children living in a building going to 12 different schools. And there's no community. The parents don't get to meet one another. They might meet in the laundry room or common space, but they're not talking together about their children and their schools, and it erodes the foundation of democracy when communities are fragmented. So in that sense, the book is a plea for paying attention to community, trying to restore the culture of the community, the connection between let's say, social networks, where children are surrounded by a network that includes their parents or guardians or grandparents, the teachers, the administrators, the people in the community. And the kids know that people know their name. If they get into trouble, somebody's going to call home. And there's a kind of an ethical core around them. What I've noticed in some of the studies that I've seen since my book came out, some of the evaluations, for example, of Chicago, where Chicago was a city that engaged vigorously in closing schools, opening schools, closing schools, opening schools. They lost social networks. There was a rise in juvenile crime. Children began moving across gang territory that was unfamiliar to them. There was a rise in the murders of young people. Social networks were sundered. This is not good. And so what I'm, in a way, pleading for is that we look at some of the deeper values in which people can be embedded in a community and not be anonymous, because it's anonymity that creates alienation, crime, kids getting lost, falling. They shouldn't fall through the cracks. There shouldn't be any cracks. And the more we can embed kids in a sense of people caring about them and knowing their names, the better off they'll be.
One of the, you've been on a pretty serious speaking schedule around the country, and I think one of the interesting subplots is the change that you went through of being the proponent for testing, charter schools, vouchers, et cetera, and then through your scholarship, changing your mind. And so as you look at No Child Left Behind and you look over the last 10 years, could you describe to us what caused you to change your mind?
Well, I have to start by saying that I have, well, for 50 years I was a registered Democrat, and then I got an invitation by Lamar Alexander to come and be Assistant Secretary of Education. And I said, well, I'm a Democrat, and he said it didn't matter, and President George H.W. Bush said it didn't matter, so I went to work as Assistant Secretary. I learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for that experience, although it did cause me to be ostracized in the academic community. But after I came through my years in the Bush administration, my 2 years in the Bush administration, and I worked at Brookings for a couple of years, I began to say, you know, maybe choice does make sense. I was surrounded by all these people who were saying choice, choice, choice all the time. And so I became increasingly a proponent of charter schools, which were just getting underway. I was never a big proponent of vouchers, although I was willing to give them a try since no one had. I thought, let's see what happens. But I thought testing and accountability would be very important because we would see where kids were, what they needed, et cetera. While I was working in the federal government, I was a strong proponent of curriculum standards, somewhat similar to what Massachusetts has, because I thought if you get, and what we did while I was there was to give grants to professional associations of teachers to develop national standards, voluntary national standards in the arts and geography and civics and history. It wasn't the No Child Left Behind, reading and math is the only thing that counts. So we had in every subject area a set of voluntary national standards, which some paid attention to and some didn't. And then I came back after my stint in Washington and at Brookings and lived in New York City, was living again in New York City. And No Child Left Behind was passed, and it got overwhelming support, bipartisan support. Ted Kennedy and stood with President George W. Bush, and you know, the two parties were together. More than 90%, I think, of the Democrats voted for it. And I thought, well, this is good. This is great. Now we'll have focus on math and reading, and kids will learn the basics and go on from there to do great stuff. And something similar happened in New York City. Mayor Bloomberg took control of the schools, and New York City developed a program that looked just like No Child Left Behind. The focus was on testing and accountability and choice. And as time went by the time I got to 2005, I began to think, I don't like what's happening. The schools aren't getting beyond reading and math. And I began to hear of schools that were dropping the arts. Schools that were not teaching history so much, and history was something I was very invested in because I had been very engaged in writing a history curriculum for the state of California. And I'd say that I should mention, I was active in two very conservative think tanks, Thomas B. Fordham Foundation in Washington, D.C., and the Hoover Institution in California. So I was with the creme de la creme of the conservative intelligentsia, and they were all gung-ho for testing, accountability, choice, vouchers, charters, and I just found myself falling away. I became a fallen away believer, and I began to argue with them, and I became increasingly on the Corrett Foundation Task Force at Hoover with John Chubb and Terry Moe and Checker Finn and sort of the creme de la creme of the right-wing education thinkers. The votes were increasingly 9-1, 10-1, 9-1, 10-1. And finally, we had a falling out over No Child Left Behind because I concluded, based on everything I'd seen, that it was not only was it not working, I concluded it was a disaster. And so my position was, when we started talking about reauthorization, I said we should repeal it. And they wanted to mend it. And so John Chubb and I ended up having a debate in a publication called Education Next, which is published, I think, at Harvard, at the Kennedy School. And his article was called Mend It, Don't End It, and my article was called End It, Don't Mend It. And I concluded it was a disaster because I could see what was happening to schools around the country where the curriculum was being narrowed and schools were being closed. And the worst thing about No Child Left Behind, from my point of view, was that it set a utopian target. And it wasn't just a target, it was a mandate. It said that 100% of children must be proficient by the year 2014 or the school will be facing draconian punishments. The school will be closed, the staff will be fired, the school will be turned into a charter or privatized or handed over to the state. And I remember asking Lamar Alexander when the law passed, and he was a new senator, and I said, do you really think 100% of kids will be proficient by the year 2014? And he said, it's good to have goals, Diane. And I said, okay, it's good to have goals, but these are not goals, these are mandates. And we are now seeing something that never happened in the history of American education. Schools are being closed because their scores are too low. The reason their scores are too low in most cases is because they have kids who don't speak English, and kids who live in desperate poverty, and kids who are homeless. And you could just go down, and school after school is in a desperately poor minority community, and they're closing the school, destroying the social networks, destroying the community, the flapping windows because everything around it is falling apart. We're not helping build community by closing schools. We're destroying community. So I think No Child Left Behind has been a terrible exercise in seeing like a state. It has caused in many communities the loss of vital programs that were not reading and math. The city of Toledo, I read recently, eliminated the arts from elementary education. To me, that's crazy. And district after district has done less science. There's less time for everything that kids actually come to school to do. More time for testing means less time for teaching. So all of those things kind of hit me, and it ended up with this book, and I lost a lot of friends.
Yeah. Some people here may not know, but I think it's correct to state that you've always been in your work a proponent of assessment of student learning. And so now to hear you talk about testing, people might get the wrong impression. Mm-hmm. But in your book, you talk about how testing actually restricts the curriculum, and you mentioned it briefly, but I'd love to have you talk about how we're using testing now and what that does to student learning.
Right. Well, if I had been able to persuade my publisher, the subtitle of my book would be How Accountability and Choice Are Undermining Education. Because it's not testing per se that's bad. Testing can be used for good or for ill, and we're using it for ill. And let me explain. I believe that testing can be valuable when it gives us good information, when it tells us whether a program is working or not working, when it tells us how we can help a student because they're not getting this part of what you were teaching. So it can help students, it can help teachers if it gives good information. But when tests are used for high stakes, when they're used to close schools and fire teachers, they're misused. And that's test-based accountability, and that's what I write about. And I think it's chapter 2 of the book where I talk about how the standards movement, which was about broadening to include the arts and all of the good stuff, civics, the things we're now neglecting, has now been narrowed to just reading and math. And now this movement has, in my view, has gotten totally out of control because Race to the Top is what I call No Child Left Behind 2.0. And it is lifted the stakes on the testing by saying if you want a share of the federal money, you have to be prepared to evaluate teachers according to the test scores of their students. And that to me is a misuse of testing, because the first rule, and I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, the first rule that every test publisher and every testing expert gave us was the test should be used only for the purpose for which they're designed. So if a test is supposed to be a test of 5th grade reading, it tests whether 5th graders are reading at grade level, and that's what they're normed for. It's not a test of teacher quality. The results of let's say, what many states are doing now is to say they're going to judge teacher effectiveness. If the scores go up, the teacher is effective. If the scores go down, the teacher's not effective. These are not good measures. There have been many studies of these, they're called value-added measures or growth models. They're highly inaccurate. And if the teacher happens to get a terrific class, the scores go up. If she gets a class with some troublemakers or disruptive students, the scores go down. If the teacher's teaching gifted class, where the scores are already very high, it's very hard to get them up very much because they're already right up against the ceiling. If the teacher's teaching autistic kids, there may not be any gain at all. So we're talking about measures that are close to meaningless, and we're going to be firing teachers. Many of these measures are on a bell curve, and half the teachers will be ineffective based on an inaccurate measure. The other thing that scares me, and nobody ever talks about this idea that test scores will be used, student test scores will be used to evaluate teachers, is that we are now, by legislation or regulation, putting in the hands of students the power to fire their teachers. That shifts the whole balance of authority in the classroom. And one of the big problems we've had in American education for many years is that teachers have lost authority as kids are more and more difficult and come from homes where nobody teaches them appropriate manners. Teacher has to have a certain measure of authority in the classroom in order to be able to teach. And now we're saying the kids get the power to fire their teachers, miss a couple of questions, choose not to exert effort, you fire her. This has got to be one of the worst things I've ever heard of. And I can tell you this because, Joe mentioned that I've been traveling a lot. I've spoken in over 100 different communities in the past year, at this point maybe 120, all over the country. The one thing that I take away from the people I've talked to, mostly teachers, and it's been over 100,000 people that I've talked to, is the profound demoralization of American teachers. They are so depressed because you don't have to be an avid reader of the newspapers to see that Teachers have become public enemy number one. They're being blamed for all the ills of society. They're hearing again and again, if the scores are low, it's your fault, teacher's fault, you didn't do a good job. And if we only had a great teacher in every classroom, every child would be making an A. Well, just a small personal anecdote, I'm one of 8 children. So same parents, same nature, same nurture, same teachers, same schools. The spectrum was very wide at the end. We did not all end up making the same grades. Differences, had different interests, different aspirations. It wasn't our teachers' fault. We all had the same teachers. But there is this kind of utopian, it's like the utopian mandate of No Child Left Behind. 100% of children will be proficient. And one more anecdote, I got an email the other day from a special ed teacher in Illinois. She's been teaching special ed for 35 years, and I get these letters all the time. I have hundreds of them on my website. She said they're now administering the Illinois Assessment Test, IASP or something like that, to the kids in special ed with all kinds of disabilities. And she was describing the incidents in the classroom. One child who eats paper and ate the test. Another one who just kept saying, not going to do this, not going to do this, throwing the papers up in the air. And they had the principal take him away, bring him back. Came back, kept throwing the papers up in the air. What's the point? Why are we doing this? I mean, tests should be used for information. They should be used to help teachers and help students. We have turned testing into the purpose of education, and testing is not the purpose of education. This is like saying, you know, it's good when you use the thermometer to discover that you have a 98.6. That's great. That shows that you don't have a fever. But we don't live our lives to have a 98.6. We have other purposes in our lives. That's just an indicator, test or indicator. They're not the goal. And through federal policy and state buy-in, we're making testing. We're turning it into a mechanism to just crush the spirits of our kids, crush the creativity, the imagination, the innovation, punish them because they didn't pick the right bubble. And sometimes, you know, that's the other piece of my conversation here. We treat these tests as though they're scientific instruments. And I said to one of your colleagues at lunch, if there is one thing that I could get across to the American people, the American public, the leadership, tests are not scientific instruments. They are not exact. They are human instruments created by fallible people. They are fallible instruments. They often contain errors. They have measurement errors. They have all kinds of errors of wording. In my 7 years on the governing board, I always read test questions in English and in history and in civics. Those were the subjects where I felt qualified. And I couldn't possibly try the math. It was too hard. But I would find errors all the time. I'd find questions where the answers were wrong, or where there were 2 correct answers, or where none of the answers were correct. And I always pull them out and say, we have to either change this or get rid of this question. And I have to just share with you one example that I spoke earlier to the faculty and students. I was in a meeting of the National Assessment Governing Board, and the government officials were putting on a show of the new civics exam, and they put up a sample question, and this was probably 10 years ago. And so the sample question said, even though we pride ourselves on being a democracy, there are parts of our system that are undemocratic. Which of the following 4 institutions is undemocratic? And the correct answer was the Supreme Court. And so it was a big room with like 400 people, and they had a projector on or PowerPoint, and I got up and said, excuse me, I don't understand this question. The Supreme Court is not undemocratic just because it's appointed. I mean, lots of people are appointed in a democratic society. They're not undemocratic. And by the way, I grew up in Texas, and we used to have billboards in the 50s all over the state that said, the Supreme Court is undemocratic. Signed, the John Birch Society.
So one of the themes in the book, and that some of us see going on in the schools, is this increasing sense of privatization of schooling. It's embedded in your comments about the community, potentially about charter schools, et cetera. And I'm interested in your description about what are the forces behind privatization, and if you would share Al Shanker's original idea for the public charter school, which I believe was the beginning of that notion.
Well, the origin of the charter movement was two people came up with this idea in the same year. One was a little-known professor in a university in Western Massachusetts, and the other was Al Shanker. They didn't know each other, but they exchanged ideas and papers. And Al Shanker obviously had a bigger platform, president of the AFT. His idea was, it started with this thought: we have many kids dropping out, and we've lost them. We have many kids who are about to drop out, and you can see that they're about to drop out because they put their head on their desk and they don't care anymore. We're going to lose them. And so he said, we have to acknowledge that school, the way we have it now organized, is not functioning well for many, many kids. And so he said, supposing that a group of teachers, public school teachers, could say to their colleagues, the 6 or 8 of us would like to create a small school within the building, which would be free of all the rules and regulations, and we could go out on the street and recruit these kids who've left and recruit the kids who are on their way out and try things that none of us would ever try. We don't know what they'll be, but let's see what would happen. And so he went around the country. This was in 1988, and he went around the country. He sold it to his locals. He sold it at the National Convention, and he really promoted this idea. And the first charter opened in 1990 in Minnesota. It's still there. It's in St. Paul. It's called City Academy, and that's what they do. It's a school for kids who dropped out, and they bring them back, and they teach them about manners and behavior and how to read and write and get basic job skills and how to write a resume, and they help them with drug issues and family issues, and it's a very holistic approach. But in 1993, Shanker saw that private entrepreneurs were moving in, and he turned against his own idea. He denounced it, in fact, in 1993 and said, this isn't working. Charters are becoming a substitute for vouchers, which he absolutely steadfastly opposed. So he became a strong critic of charters at that point. And the thing with charters is they recently have been the subject of a huge media campaign with that movie Waiting for Superman, and there's a lot of money supporting this idea, and there's not time to go into it, but Waiting for Superman is basically a pro-privatization propaganda tract funded by very right-wing money. The main producer is a guy named Philip Anschutz, who is a billionaire who donates heavily to pro-privatization think tanks like the ones I used to be involved in, and to pro-voucher organizations, and to the Discovery Institute, which opposes the teaching of evolution in the public schools, and to anti-gay rights activities in Colorado and California, on and on. That's the big funding. So follow the money is a useful thing. And it tells the story, of the only hope for saving American kids is to escape public schools and go to charter schools. Now, the bottom line here is that some charter schools are excellent, do a great job, get wonderful test results, graduation results. Some of the ones that get excellent test results have incredible attrition rates, and they're dropping kids like flies. Like one of the schools in Waiting for Superman is the Seed Charter School, and they advertise on their website that 96% of their graduates go to college, which is true, but what they don't tell you is that 75% of the kids who start drop out. So they have a 75% attrition rate. That was with their last class. And that's an improvement, because when they first started, they had a 90% attrition rate. And many of these high-flying charter schools have very small percentages of English language learners, very small percentages of kids who are special education. And comparing them to a neighborhood public school is like comparing apples and oranges, because the neighborhood public school then has a disproportionate number of English language learners and of kids with special needs. So there's a lot of skimming that goes on, there's a lot of exclusion, and they're also able to push out kids with low scores. And I've seen example after example of this. Charter school movement is an interesting movement because it ranges across the board from the really high-performing, excellent schools, of which there are some, to really abysmal schools that should never be allowed to operate, but for some reason continue to. There are over 5,000 charter schools. There will soon be many more because the Obama administration is pushing them as part of the race to the top. I'm not sure why they're pushing them, except that the Gates Foundation believes strongly in charters, the Broad Foundation believes in charters, the Walton Family Foundation believes in charters. The right wing has always believed in charters because it's choice. and it was a good, as Shanker predicted, a good substitute for vouchers. When I was at the Hoover Institution, all of my colleagues were very strong for charters as the best way to shrink the public sector and to get public money out of the government's hands and into private hands. I'm sure there are many people who support charters who do so out of the most idealistic and philanthropic motives, wanting to help poor kids escape from low-performing public schools. But whatever the charters may do or not do, my bottom line belief is that if you look around the world, it's hard to find a high-performing nation, at least I don't know of a high-performing nation that does not have a really excellent public school system. There is no nation that I know of that's high-performing that is deprofessionalizing education, lowering standards for entry into teaching, lowering standards for entry into becoming a principal, let's say inducting non-teachers as principals, as many of our cities and states are now doing, and bringing in non-educators as superintendents. If you ask someone from the highest performing nation, which is Finland, about that, they would think you were nuts. The principals are master teachers, the superintendents are master teachers and master principals. They wouldn't dream of bringing in a publishing executive and making him or her the head of a big school system. So what I see is, again, charters should collaborate with public schools, but because of No Child Left Behind, they too are incentivized to get higher and higher test scores, and many of the charter chains are now supported very heavily, funded very heavily by Wall Street hedge fund managers who think innovation, break up the monopoly, overnight success, and so there's a lot of money behind the charter movement, with the foundation supporting it, with Wall Street hedge fund managers investing in it. And many of them are doing this quite consciously with the intention of using competition to beat public education. We should not be trying to beat public education. We should be trying to strengthen public education. And I don't want to see charter schools disappear. They're not going to disappear. But I would like to see a collaborative approach between charters and public schools. And I would like to say that any time a superintendent or a school leader gets up and boasts about their test scores, they should be fired. Because this would be like your lawyer putting an ad in the paper and say, I won more cases than anybody else. You wouldn't want that lawyer. You'd say, that lawyer's a shyster. And every time somebody tells you about a miracle school where the scores went up by 40 points in 1 year, it's not true. They manipulated the data. And this is happening more and more. In our pursuit of high test scores, we're introducing the spirit of competition. It does not improve public education, and it creates this incentive to compete where competition does not, in fact, improve schools. So that's a sort of elaborate answer to your thoughtful question.
I've got one more question. Let's stay on the test score piece. You're in Massachusetts, as the governor indicated. Everybody here knows Massachusetts got the highest scores in the country. But my question might be, doesn't mean to be disrespectful to that. Embedded within those scores, though, is a huge achievement gap that, you know, the Department of Education here has documented, that Paul has spoken eloquently about. And I guess so my question is, given the dramatic achievement gap in student performance that is so often based upon income, race, ethnicity, geography, are we an ideal case study for the caution about being number one in the country?
Well, I think that Massachusetts in this case, I don't think that Paul's going to go out and say we're number one and wave his finger in front of the other state superintendents, but everybody knows Massachusetts is number one. Bear in mind that No Child Left Behind was passed on the wings of the Texas Miracle, and that was in 2000 during the election. We kept hearing from the media, and nobody asked many questions about this. Texas had this miracle. All they had to do was test, publish the results, disaggregate the scores by race, English language, all these different measures, and the achievement gap was closing, and the test scores were rising, and the graduation rates were rising. It turned out not to be true. Texas is dead center. Massachusetts, on the last NAEP, I think something like 48% of the fourth graders were proficient in reading. In Texas, it was something like 28%. So there was no Texas miracle. It was nonsense. But I think that Massachusetts can be justly proud of the excellence of its schools, and there is a large achievement gap, and it's not because of bad schools in Massachusetts. It's because there are pockets of poverty in Massachusetts, and pockets of high needs. And if you think that the schools alone can solve that problem, it can't be done. And I go back to the interconnection between schools and communities, schools and societies. We could go all the way back to the founding of this university or college, and to John Dewey, who talked about the interrelationship between schools and society. We cannot expect schools to solve all the problems of society. We're doing well if they do a good job of education, but the achievement gap exists on the first day of school. The achievement gap exists before children ever meet a teacher. The teachers don't cause the achievement gap. The achievement gap exists because children have differential opportunities before they ever get to school. Some children live in homes where their parents are college educated, where there are books in the home, where the parents talk with elaborate vocabularies to the children and around the children, and the children hear many words, and they come to school already knowing their colors and knowing the letters, and sometimes they can come to school on the first day already knowing how to read. And they've been on trips, they've been to the museum, maybe they have a library card. They've had many experiences. The children who grow up in homes where English is not spoken don't speak English, surprise. And then there are children who live in poverty where their parents are high school dropouts, where they have moved from home to home to home because of the economic instability in their lives, where they have not had the advantages either of parental education or books in the home or of the rich vocabulary, where the vocabulary that they've heard is yes, no, shut up, sit down, leave me alone, go away. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference. And study after study has shown this about vocabulary level. Key issue is when you come to school, are you ready for school? Some kids are super ready for school, and some kids are not. And the kids who are not need help. And so if you said to me, the inevitable next question is, what do we need? We need to have prenatal care so that when children are in the womb, their mothers get the right nutrition. Many children are born with birth defects and problems that could have been avoided. Many children have learning disabilities because of the lack of adequate prenatal care. We need to have an approach that looks at the years from birth to 5 and provides the support that families need, that mothers need, that parents need, so that children have the adequate nutrition and medical care so that they're not suffering from diseases that are easily preventable. And then we have to deal with the fact that many kids are growing up in communities where there's not much support for learning, where they're taught to be tough, and that it's, these are all social issues. And the school, the teacher didn't cause them. The teacher is one of the solutions, but not the only solutions. The other solutions have to come from the broader society, from government. And those who want to shrink government by shrinking the services that are so desperately needed by people who are poor are harming our society, and they should be called out for it.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.